Welcome. In this video, we will implement a service and add it to the fluidOps service catalog. So to get started, we logged into eCloud Manager on a fresh installation, and we navigate to the service icon down here in this overview page. And in the service catalog, we can click on Show Administrative Controls, and we can create a new infrastructure or a new management service and so on. We can also add a new service category down here. There's a little bit of Java code that is required to before we add the service here on the GUI, and we'll go through this right now. Okay, we switch to the runtime folder. This is the folder where your fluidOps software is installed, and we have a look at the scripts folder. So in the scripts folder, we prepared a couple of files. First of all, we get started in the meta-inf services under com fluidOps API dynamic service factory. So let's have a look at this file. This is a common Java service loader, which points the runtime to an implementation of the service factory. So in this case, this is the com fluidOps API example folder service factory. So the actual implementation is located in here. So we can have a look at the package, follow along the package structure, com fluidOps API example. And first of all, we look at the folder service factory. So this is a Groovy script, which is compiled at runtime and can also be changed on the fly. And this is the class or the implementation that the service loader under meta-inf points to. So let's have a look at this one first. So this is follows a certain blueprints. So we implement the service factory, which is a common interface that's provided by the fluidOps SDK. And we have a service name, which is simply the class, the simple name of the class, which would be the folder service. There's a create, which simply instantiates a new instance of the folder service implementation. And finally, there's a documentation, which has a little text which shows up on the respective GUIs and in the REST endpoint later on. So next, let's have a look at the interface. That's the most interesting part. So we go to the folder service. The folder service is an interface which describes the contract between the clients, which are REST clients, as well as the self-service GUI and the service implementation on the backend. So in this case, it's the folder service, which extends basic service, which comes from the fluidOps SDK. The folder service is a very simple example, which allows us to create folders on the file system, touch folders to update their timestamp, and also delete folders at the end. This is, of course, a very simplistic example. Could also very well be something like creating virtual machines, creating accounts on a software as a service, or other services as well, of course. The service has three methods. The first one is the create action. So this is denoted by this Java annotation, indicating that this method actually creates the instance. There's a callable from widget annotation, which gives us an authorization stating that self-service users are allowed, or if you're in the self-service role, you're allowed to invoke this method. There's a documentation telling us what the method is actually doing. And very important is that the contract between the contract for a create method is that it returns the URI of the newly created instance. The parameters, we have three of them. So first of all is the service ID, denoting the fact that this is creates something for the folder as a service identifier. The second one is that the URI, the ID of the create action, which is used to instantiate the folder. And finally, there's the name of the folder, which is being passed. And this is the only free parameter here, basically, So there can be many more which are passed, but we decided to only have one. And this is a special parameter because it has the label attribute telling the platform that this parameter passed in name is to be used for the string representation or the RDFS label to provide a human readable display of this resource on the UI. The parameters tell us about the name, the type, description of the parameter, as well as indicating whether the parameter is required or not. Second, we have the touch, which is a lifecycle operation which can be applied many times on the instance. So this is if you do the infrastructure service analogy, this could be something like start, stop, virtual machine, pause virtual machine, etc. Those also would be lifecycle operations or lifecycle actions. That's why it has the action annotation. Has a similar callable from widget with authorization as well as a documentation. The parameters are very similar. The difference here is that the service instance is being passed as well as the identifier of the action. So the service instance is actually the self-service or the notion of the self-service instance which is created. So it's more or less the booking that identifies that a certain customer books a resource on the backend, and this parameter here is the actual resource. So this would be the actual folder in our case, or the actual virtual machine, which again is different from this one up here, which identifies again the booking of the resource. Note that only the first two parameters are required from a framework perspective. The third parameter is sort of best practice, or it's something that's obviously very usable, because once the resource is created, you can also attach certain information to that resource, which you can use in later steps. So it's always a good idea to pass the resource ID. Finally, we have the delete action. So that's the special type of action which terminates the booking, which has, again, similar annotations. And again, here the parameters are the instance, so the booking of this folder, the delete action, as well as the actual resource, which is being connected to the user via the booking instance up here. Okay, finally, we look at the implementation of the service. So we have a class folder service impl, which implements our folder service. And again, we find our create, touch, and delete methods. And here we have a couple of lines of code. So first of all, we compute the URI of the resource instance, which is created by this operation. So again, this is not to be confused with the actual booking. This is really the ID of the folder, or the representation of the folder in the graph database world. So in this case, we just use the self-service namespace followed by the folder name. We then have the actual beef, so to speak, the code that actually creates the folder on the file system. Again, here we could issue PowerShell commands. We can SSH to host. We can do REST calls, SOAP calls, whatever is necessary to perform the action. This little bit of boilerplate out there with annotations and so on is merely necessary to allow the fluidOps platform to manage all the service records and have the self-service GUI functional. Finally, we attach a couple of statements. So we attach statements on this new resource instance, which we created up here. So we basically say the type is a certain resource. We attach the label, which is the literal version of the folder name. And we also have a special folder name, which is where we just repeat the folder name. So you can add arbitrary instances or arbitrary graph statements and attach them to this resource instance. It's probably a good idea to keep the parameters that were used and so on. So it depends on the use case a little bit. The touch operation, here we see one statement about the job framework. So you can invoke a job context and add messages stating to the platform or the job that is running right now, if you have multiple steps indicating what you're currently working on, what your progress is, and what you're currently doing. And also you can propagate error messages using the job framework. So this is a small example of how this works. Then we retrieve the folder name, which we basically added up here. So this is more or less the inverse statement. It's the inverse statement of this one. In this case, we write the SES folder name, and down here we read the SES folder name, have it in the folder name again, and then again, this is the actual beef that uses the Java SDK to set the timestamp on the folder. And finally, the same thing for the delete. We again take the resource instance and read the SES folder name, which was written by the create operation, and use this as a parameter to do the actual folder deletion. So this concludes the coding part. Again, it's a little bit of boilerplate, but there's a lot of functionality that is taken over by the platform for you, and there's a lot of things you don't need to worry about anymore, and you can really focus on the actual implementation. Again, we have make directory, we have setting the timestamp, and we have the deletion of the folder. And again, here, logically, folder as a service maybe not so interesting, merely serves as an example here. You would probably invoke some REST or some PowerShell scripts at this point. Okay, so now let's look at the platform and see how we can actually add this service to the service catalog and define the GUI for it and then run it through the self-service portal. Okay, so we switch back to where we started, where we left off, and we create a new infrastructure service. Let's just call it FAAS for folder as a service. So this page is the administration overview page where you immediately see dependent resources, instance events, instances of all users, and so on. So of course this is all empty because nothing has been deployed yet. So, well, first we can switch to the wizard, which contains the create operation. So it has been pre-filled with some content. So let's have a look at the wiki here. And so there's a code execution widget. Let's have a look at this one here. And of course, here we need to, so the create operation is correct, but here we need to switch to the correct class. And that's something we can find in here. So we can look at the folder service. Let's first copy the package. Okay, add this here, and then let's add the folder service. Okay. Create operation is okay. So we need 3 parameters. First one is the ID of the service. The ID of the service we can find out over here. So we're adding a new page. So we have this unpublished service at the moment. And let's just copy and paste this URL. So this is the service ID that we're just passing as a constant. The second parameter is the ID of the action. That would be the current wizard page. This would be SES wizard, folder as a service wizard. So this is okay. And the third parameter is the name, which is added through a user input. You can change the display name to folder name. And we're done. Okay, so we change this and press save. Okay, we have a small error message saying that we have one parameter too many, and the reason is simply the fact that we have the pass context. So this, let's have a look at this information item. Add the code execution context as a first argument. Default is false. So that's something that we actually don't need, and that's not supported by the methodology we're using in this example. So you can refer to the SDK documentation if you want to leverage this, but let's just move this to false for now and say submit and press save again, and here we go. So the folder as a service is now ready to go, and well, let's try it out. We can just run it. We enter the folder name. Let's just use ZZZZ. And let's hit submit. The job is running and it's finished. And it also brings up the URI of the new service instance that was created. Okay, so we see that here, and also redirects to the page. Well, the page is empty. That's not a big surprise because we haven't really configured anything yet. So let's have a look at, let's go back on the administration page. Well, let's see here. So we see that user admin just created this instance. We can also check the file system. Go to the runtime, and here's the ZZZ folder, which was created. So everything worked fine. And of course, now the next step would be to define the actions and define what's supposed to show up on such an instance page. So let's go to the instance again and have a look at the wiki. And there's a couple of templates. So first of all, it's a service instance, and it's also a folder as a service instance. So let's visit the folder as a service instance. And let's switch to the text editor here. And you see there's some wiki text prepared already. So let's remove the comments. And let's change this text, and let's just use the default template for a service instance, the service instance include. Okay, so let's save this, and we can go back. And now immediately we have some information. So we have some events that possibly occurred. We have some records, which immediately show that this instance was created a couple minutes ago. And we also have the actions show up immediately. So maybe let's add a no talk in the beginning. Okay, and here we go. Oops, one too many. So again, this is service-specific content. You're free to change this and add some custom information on your template. You're also free to change the template if you don't want the events to show up, and so on. So now let's look at the actions in the next step. So again, we go to the service overview, and here we go to the service designer. Okay, and let's go down here. And so there's a couple of sample actions which we have. So the delete action obviously makes a lot of sense. So let's go to that action. And you can see here that it's simply a small wiki page with a certain code execution widget. And that one, of course, we need to adapt again. So we have the method delete, that's correct. And again, we need to go to the folder service and add the package name in the beginning. Then the context, we don't want to pass that. Let's not forget this. This is the button to display. And in this case, we need 3 arguments. So let's check in the code again. The first one is the instance, so that would be the this parameter. So we have this here ready. The second one is the actual delete action, so that's folders to service delete. That's the action ID. And we have a third parameter, which is the ID of the actual resource. And so there's a default connection between the service booking or the service instance and the actual resource, and we can show you how you can look this up. So if we go to an instance, in this case, and if we go to the table view and have a look at the actual data, you can see that down here there's a represented resource which connects the current service instance to the actual folder ID. And you remember that in the code we set this to SES folder name, and that's exactly this that you see down there in the pop-up. So we basically need to traverse this property here. So let me just copy and paste this. And so the third parameter would be from the current resource, I go to SES service instance represented by resource. And that's basically the third parameter. So let me submit this. Should do a double check, but I think everything's okay. On finish, we want to reload, and we have our 3 parameters. Context is set to pass to false. So we're basically ready to go with this action. And now let's do the example action here. So this one is an example action, so let's delete this and create a new one. Okay, let's go to the table editor and add a thumbnail, because we forgot it in the initial dialog. Okay, save those changes here. Go back. Okay, so the thumbnail is here, and now we can actually just copy and paste this wiki page here. So copy, go to the touch page. So we're doing the UI of this touch page now, and so you want to touch this instance on finish reload is fine. The arguments are fine except for this service touch as the action ID. The label is touch as well. Okay, perform action as the render button, and the method must be touch also. Okay, so we're ready. And now we have this defined the button functionality. We have changed it to the respective backend code, and now we can actually try out the service. So let's go back here. Try our folders as service again. Let's create a new one. Let's call it YYY. Okay. And now, so this folder has been created. YYY is over here. And we can now have a look at this one here. We can delete it, or we can, well, let's touch it. Do you really want to touch this instance? Okay. So the action was performed. We had the creation of YYY. We also have the service record indicating that we did this touch operation. Well, let's do it again. So we can also have a look at the timestamp, and we can make sure that this changes here. Okay, so let's do another touch. And you can see now this is at 7 o'clock. Okay. You can also note that not only the self-service GUI that you see here is able to trigger this functionality, but you can also use the REST endpoint. So let's do this here. We can go to REST JSON, and we see our folder service here with exactly these things. And well, let's do another touch operation here. So the instance ID we can find here. The action ID is sys action folder service touch, and the resource ID would be, well, that's easy. That says :YYY. Okay, so we can execute this request. The result is okay, and now we go back to the page here and refresh it. You can see that another touch was performed. Okay, so you see that basically the self-service GUI and the REST API are completely in sync. And even through the REST API, all of these service records that allow you to keep track of what happened when, which is, of course, also very important information for billing, is also tracked. Okay, so finally I can delete this folder, and now it says the resource no longer exists, and I have the information that this is an inactive resource. And that's also important why there's a service instance, because the service instance, the booking basically sticks around, whereas the actual service resource, the folder disappears and might be picked up by another provider, and the actual RDF values can disappear from the database, but the record that this booking took place doesn't really disappear. Okay, so we basically implemented the service, and it's operational now. So the next thing would be to actually try it out from the self-service portal. So let's do that. First of all, I'll create a user that I can use to log in through the portal. Okay, so create a new user, call him test, password test, email is test at test.test. Okay, so if I visit this user, I'll make him part of an organization. Okay, so let's add the organization here, which is fluidOps. Okay. Okay, next step would be to publish the service. So let's go to the setup page and so what folder of the service we publish to customer fluidOps and initialize the marketplace. Okay, that's it. So next step is to log in using our test user. So I'll use a different browser. We can stay in as admin, as test. And here's the portal. And we can go to our catalog, which shows the folders of service. Okay, and I can now use the wizard to run, let's call the XXX folder. So now I have my service instance. Go to my instances here. I see a deployment with a calendar. I can touch it. And of course I can delete it. So let's just check. Here's my folder. I can delete this folder again and now it's gone. Okay, and let's maybe check back with the admin page. So we can have a look at the folders of service and I can see that user test has this instance going and that basically admin and test were active on the service. Okay, this concludes the demonstration. Just to wrap up, we basically created metadata for a service. We showed the implementation or the skeleton implementation of a service using Java, again with the ability from there to jump to other programming languages and invoke external services. You've seen how these annotations basically take care of the service record handling, making sure that either through the REST API or the self-service clients or the self-service UI, you have all the ability to track every operation, to control publishing the services and so on. Okay, thank you very much for your interest.